Hey, this is Tim Dillon of Tim Dillon is Going to Hell. And let me tell you right now, you guys should definitely subscribe to the Gas Digital Network. Use the promo code HELL. You can subscribe to only my show, which is $250, but I would definitely subscribe to the whole network. You get a lot of great shows like Sex, Drugs, and Rock and Roll, Part of the Problem with Dave Smith, Louis J. Gomez's Real Ass Podcast. Basically, you get the entire network for about $6 a month, which includes all the live video feed. You're going to get a lot of bonus content, and everything that is not going to be available to people that don't subscribe, you will have access to immediately. So please get on the network. We look forward to having you listening.
Tim Dillon is Going to Hell.
We're going to really take a hard, critical look at the people that society's decided to hate, the billionaires, the dictators, the CEOs.
On Gas Digital Network.
We know that there are bad things in the world, there are bad people, and thank God for them.
Won't you join him?
What's good without evil? Welcome to Tim Dillon's Going to Hell, everybody. I'm very excited. This is a special episode today. I am joined by, as always, my co-host Ray Kump, but it's very rare that you meet somebody in life that has actually really impacted the way you see the world. One of those guys is in the studio today. He's an investigative reporter. He's written for publications, like The New Yorker, Vanity Fair, The Nation. He attended Columbia University. He was an editor on the Columbia Journalism Review. He won a Deadline Award for reporting on George W. Bush's military service. And he's the author of a book that I think is essential reading if you are interested at all in how the country is run. The book is called Family of Secrets. It was published in 2008. It is about the Bush family, but about much more than that. The subtitle here is America's Invisible Government and the Hidden History of the Last 50 Years. I would pick this up if you can. I would buy it.
Absolutely.
100%. Go and buy this book right now. He is also the founder of WhoWhatWhy.org, which is a nonprofit. It's one of my go-to places every day now. And I think it's the home of some of the best reporting on the web. Russ Baker, thank you for coming in.
I'm glad to be here. Fun.
Okay.
I enjoyed. I actually wanted to walk up the 4 flights of stairs.
We have an elevator.
I was disappointed by that, but you gave me the wrong address, so I went 2 doors down.
Yes.
Nobody answered. I said, "Well, that's typical radio people." So
right.
I actually snuck in with the pizza guy. This is okay. I climbed 4 flights of stairs.
We run a very professional operation.
I can see that.
Yeah. No. So I'm glad you got it. But that's a guy like you who wrote a book like that. You can get in. You're going to find a way to get in, whether it's with the pizza guy. Or anybody. One thing I want to start, because I want to talk a little bit about Who, What, Why, because it is something, and I think, and I don't know if this is a feeling that you have, but I feel like this is a website that is now getting more attention. People are sharing articles I see on Facebook, on Twitter, and one of the things I love about your website, and I think, again, everybody should go, it's WhoWhatWhy.org. One of the things is right after something happens, right after a big news story, you do not have a story up 5 minutes later. There is a significant amount of time where you're doing, I think, your due diligence. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Basically, what we do is we talk amongst ourselves and we say, what the hell do you think that was about?
Right.
And so when everybody's rushing to get the so-called early reports, breaking news, where, typical thing with something like the cable networks where they have people in the field and they don't know anything, and then the host saying, so can you fill us in? And they're saying, well, so we're getting information, we're waiting for information. The latest we've heard is, and of course they're repeating what the anchor had just said, so they don't know anything. We don't want to do that. We want to figure out what's really going on, what happened, why it happened, and why it matters, and that takes a little bit longer.
Absolutely. When did the idea for the website, where did that come from?
It came from being in the media for a long time and being frustrated by the way we're supposed to behave in covering stories. One of the things I noticed very early on, and I kind of wondered if it was me and if I was just strange or if there was something else going on, which was that there was very quickly a consensus. Actually, this goes back to when I was a child and we would watch the evening news together. A Vietnam War was playing,
right.
and they would Walter Cronkite, and then you'd switch to David Brinkley and so on, and ABC, and they all had the same stories. And I remember asking my dad, I said, are these the only stories there are? Because they all have the same stories. And when I got into journalism, I found that's what you do. Everybody follows. There's some sense from the pack, and it used to be the New York Times that would set the agenda. And so it was always very important for people who wanted to shape public perceptions to make sure that they had friends in the right places at the New York Times, because the whole country and the whole zeitgeist would follow.
Did you always want to be a journalist?
No, I wanted to be well paid, but that never worked out. So I ended up being a journalist instead.
Sorry, Russ, can you get a little closer to the mic?
Sure. Yeah.
Am I wrong in that your title is an investigative reporter? It seems to be a dying breed.
Yeah, it is dying. It's probably the most expensive kind of journalism because it takes a really long time to do your research.
Right.
And if it's interesting, it also takes a really long time to write it up in some comprehensible way. So that's the first thing that they cut. Although these news organizations also regret cutting it because it is also the sexiest material and it's the most, let's say, proprietary. So it's what sets them apart from everybody, because everybody else is all covering the same stories on a superficial basis.
Right. And so basically, as an investigative reporter, you begin to start looking at how George W. Bush became president.
I did. I was actually living in, oddly enough, the former Yugoslavia in Belgrade, Serbia, and when the run-up to the war began, and because I was outside the United States, I wasn't subject to the same sort of sensory assault from the American media, which was all basically beating the drums for a war.
Right.
And I was watching other things. I had a satellite dish on my apartment, and I was watching these European news channels, and they were more skeptical. And it seemed to me that we hadn't really seen any evidence. It also seemed to me very clear that there was an agenda driving it, that they wanted this war. And so I became very interested in that, and I thought, why did they want this war? And then Bush was running for re-election, and they had already discovered there were no weapons of mass destruction, and I thought, well, he can't possibly be re-elected. And then there's this John Kerry fellow who's a war veteran, a military war hero who's anti-war, and then there's George Bush, who's pro-war and who we hear skipped out on Vietnam War service. I said, what a story. I got to get back to the U.S. and cover this. And that's what I did. I came back and began covering the election, and some of the publications I was writing for said, look, there's almost no way that anything you find will change anything because Bush is going to win. And I remember somebody said to me, it was really like the saying of former Governor Edwin Edwards of Louisiana. He said, the only way I can lose if I'm found with a live boy or a dead girl. And that's what they told me about George W. Bush. They said, there's really nothing you can do. And so I found all these amazing things, and they kept saying, not big enough, not big enough, not big enough. And then I started looking into this military service thing, and it was clear to me that he had actually dodged the military while his father was a prominent government official and managed to get away with it. And I said, how did they do that? How did they cover that up? Got me interested in the family. I wanted to learn more about them, about where this sort of hapless and improbable guy came from and how he could become the most powerful person in the world. These things fascinate me.
Because it was a great American, and it was a great American story. This guy who, this party guy that sobered up, found Jesus, got serious, dedicated himself, And, most people who do that become a good mechanic, but he became the president. So it is an interesting story, the flip side of that. Ray, you were going to...
Well, we touched on the weapons of mass destruction, how they didn't find them. Now, in the lead-up, they had doctored evidence to get us into the war. It didn't seem like there was a point when they first went in and we hadn't found them yet, and we're saying to people, if they don't find them, they better just put them there. And there seems to be, if they're going to be willing to do that to get us into it, do you have any take on that? Like, why there was no even attempt to try and even, was it almost intentional as a way of kind of beating down the public on a long-term level, psychologically? Like, we don't even need to explain ourselves.
I was never entirely able to figure that out, but the truth is that they're really not all that good at what they do.
Right.
And this is important, is that they're an odd mix of incompetence and ruthlessness, and together, of course, that's a very sort of potent formula.
It's a great combination. Yeah, incompetence and ruthlessness.
That's great.
So you look into this family, and you start to find things. Now, before you wrote this book, I know that you were a reporter. You probably lean left, I would imagine. But were you, before you wrote this book, in what you would consider like the mainstream of American political thought?
I think I was. I mean, I think most people in journalism, most people actually deal with people,
right,
where they're not ordering them around, are sort of somewhat bleeding heart because they're people, and you discover, hey, these are people. Now, when you're, a zillionaire and everybody around you are basically people on your payroll, and of course, you yell at them when you can't find your shoe and so forth. But I think that ordinary people, whether you're a social worker or whatever, unless everybody you deal with is a complete shithead, then you end up sort of at least relating to them somehow and understanding that they are human beings. And you see somebody sleeping on the street, you don't think that's so great, and you wish something could be done about that. So, yeah, I mean, I think I was like that. But I think one of the main things was that I didn't know anything about something that I now call a deep state dynamics or deep politics, which is an understanding of, let's say, the sort of configurations of power within a society that perpetuate certain policies and certain elites. And it's just something we don't know anything about. It's something that the media knows nothing about, if they know about it, they don't talk about it. And this is really what I think changed my life. It led to Family of Secrets, which is a book that's about the deep state, and it led to some extent to the founding of WhoWhatWhy, because I felt there needed to be a news site, a news organization that did recognize this dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, it is something that I remember. This is one of the only books I've read that I've gotten chills when I read the book. With certain things I read, I felt like I was opening a door that hadn't been opened before. And I think, some of the most interesting material in the book centers around not so much George W. Bush, but his father, Poppy Bush, who I think is a guy that we were kind of sold this narrative that he was just kind of a lovable guy that was like bumbling through history. And I think you find that he lived something that we would call a secret life for the majority of his life. And what was the thing? Was there one piece of information that sent you looking for that? Was there one particular day that you remember finding something and going, wait a minute?
I think there was. It had to do with George W. Bush's essentially going AWOL during the Vietnam War. And I discovered that he had... Basically, what they had done was, for some reason, they had to get him out of his flying responsibility with the Texas Air National Guard,
the Champagne Unit,
the so-called Champagne Unit. They shipped him over to Alabama, and they put him on a political campaign of a friend of the father's, and he was supposed to continue his service there on a land-based unit. But records show and interviews show that he never served. And I think it's actually possible that the father never knew this. And the father had served in World War II. This is very important to the family. It's very important politically. The grandfather, World War I. It's very important to them that everybody serve, either from an honorable or a public relations standpoint, up to you to choose. But that was important. And so I got the distinct impression that over the Christmas break of I'm going to get this wrong, 68 maybe, he went home, W went back to family who was living in Washington, and they had a huge fight, and that fight has been reported before, but I don't think anybody knew what the fight was about. And I think basically the father asked the son something about his military service, and he said, I just blew it off, and the father went bananas. This is my surmise. And so the father said, well, you have just ruined your political future and maybe my political future. We can't survive this thing. And so the father began covering it up, and the way that he covered it up and the strings that he pulled, his ability to, well, I'm not going to say he did it, but let's put it this way: records disappeared, records were destroyed in fires that destroyed entire facilities. People couldn't remember things. And here's to me, believe it or not, this is the most interesting thing of all, is George W. Bush had moved out of Alabama. He'd moved back to Texas. But on his way from Washington, he stops off in, I want to say, I think it was Montgomery, where the base was, stops off there, calls a woman he had dated a couple of times, shows up to pick her up on a date, is wearing his uniform, and he says to her, yeah, I'm here just doing a little more of my National Guard service. And then he also goes onto the base, and he goes into the dental clinic, and they see a guy in uniform. He's got access to the base. They do bite wings on him, a routine exam. Years later, when he's president of the United States, they trot out these bite wings as evidence that he served in the military. And of course, this woman is interviewed, and she says, well, I remember him serving. She didn't remember him serving. She remembered him picking her up for a date, very deliberately wearing this uniform.
And yeah, the ability to do that, the ability to cover things up on that level, the thought to just cover your tracks in that way. Was that evidence to you that there was something at work here more than just being a capable politician?
Right. So the son, I don't think, had a mind that was quite that wily.
Nimble, right.
Nimble. And I think that pointed to the father, that the father had quickly come up with this solution. And so, a lot of people talk about the Bushes, and they're maybe not all that bright and so on, but they have a certain kind of a native intelligence. The son, very charming, thinks quick on his feet. I think you may remember him from the debates. He was pretty darn good for a guy who didn't know any of the answers.
Right.
And the father had the same thing. He admitted that he had a problem with the vision thing. He couldn't really quite get any vision about anything. But when it came to stuff, and this went back, I looked to the father through his whole life, and at a very early point in his life, he had been reprimanded for telling the truth about something and putting something on paper, and they told him never to do that again. And this, I think, was a turning point for the father, and where his mind really, I don't want to say it snapped, but he really went into the dark recesses.
Now, this is interesting because you've spent so much time studying these guys. Have you ever met them? Any of them?
They just don't invite me over.
They just don't. Because I was so, at no point in your career, even pre-writing Family Secrets, were you ever in the same room with any of them? Not even a jab.
It just doesn't happen.
Doesn't happen, right.
Yeah, I mean, I have actually met people who are one step removed from them, including somebody who knows them extremely well. Who
are they aware of you, do you think?
They are aware of me. They are aware of the book, believe it or not.
Wow. Yeah. Interesting. I know that Maureen...
Are they fans of the book?
Yeah, what do you think they think about the book?
I know that... I believe this isn't a book. I called one man who was a very important figure in one of the many dark subtexts of the book, who had been very close with Poppy.
I think I know who this is, correct. Or maybe not. Maybe his name's
called him up, and his name is in the book. I called him up, and I explained that I wanted to talk to him about his activities using an oil company as cover for intelligence work and covert operations back in the 1950s, 1960s. And he was silent for a moment, and he didn't say I was crazy or I had called the wrong number. He was silent, and then he said, am I authorized to talk to you?
Right.
And then I said, well, authorized by who? And then he said, well, as the Bush family, is this an approved biography? Which tells you a lot about how things work.
Yeah.
And I said, no, it's not.
Right.
And he said, well, let me call, and I'll get back to you. And believe it or not, I can't remember.
And is this Jim Bath?
No. Okay. No. This is another person.
Okay.
This was a sort sort of an investment banker slash
Okay.
oil guy. And he called me back very graciously, and I think he actually left this on my answering machine, which is, again, another fascinating thing about these ex-CIA people, that they're not always
Right.
on the ball with this stuff. But he left a message basically saying something like, I talked to the old man and he said, "You're crazy and don't talk to you." So
Okay.
he at least knows me well enough to form some kind of a judgment.
Now,
Yeah.
as a journalist, when he asks you, "Is this authorized?" Does any part of you think to lie to him and go, "Oh yeah, I thought," or is that kind of like, where you get into trouble? Like,
Of course it occurs to me. That's how we get in with the pizza guy.
Yeah.
But the idea is not to lie. The idea is to not volunteer information that will prevent you from getting an interview. So we try to be honest, but we try to be, what's the right word? We try to be congenial,
Right.
and to not seem too scary.
So now some of the revelations in the book, like for example, you look at the life of Poppy Bush, who's George W. Bush's father, and you come to the conclusion that you believe he was a deep cover intelligence officer for the majority of his life. If you told most people that, like I was at a family barbecue, and you try to bring some of this stuff up, and they look like, if I said, "Hey, George H.W. Bush was actually a deep," they would go, "Oh, okay, well he was just doing his patriotic duty for the country." But the thing that really kind of grabbed me was this interview that most people don't know anything about, where he admits to not knowing where he was the day that JFK was shot, which seems crazy.
Yeah, well, to your first point,
Yeah.
we live in a time where, I don't want to say nothing matters, but it seems like almost nothing matters. So if you tell people that somebody did something, they love to say, "Doesn't surprise me." It's funny.
That's a great point.
If you look at Amazon and you look at the reader reviews on Family of Secrets, it's
Right.
almost solid 5 stars. It's like 4.6
right.
or something. But there's a few who write other things, and they're usually usually not too swift. They usually write things like, "The book arrived late." They don't seem to know that it's not a review of Amazon delivery. It's a review of my book. So there are those things. And then there are people who say, "This man's a Bush hater. I didn't even have to read the book to know that." but the other category of people
Yeah.
are people who actually write, "Yeah, I already knew all this." Well, since I didn't know it and nobody
Yeah.
knew it except 3 people in the Bush family or
Right.
the CIA, they're obviously wrong, but they think all worst case scenarios are assumed.
Right.
And so, for example, George H.W. Bush was the CIA director for a single year, and people conflate that with the notion that he was a deep cover CIA officer for 30 or 40 years while using a cover as a diplomat, an oil man, and so on. And they don't understand the difference between the two. They don't understand the difference between somebody who publicly was a non-intelligence person who was in politics and was made to be the CIA director because he was going to sort of create a clean break for an agency that was in trouble publicly. That was the official story, and that he had no background connections or ties. And what I'm saying, which is the actual real reason they put him in, was because he was an inside guy who was part of the ongoing cover-up that was absolutely essential, and that the CIA had effectively, almost, you could say, really had taken over the United States, that there was effectively a coup. And in that way, it's very similar to Vladimir Putin and
Right.
what happened to the so-called Russian
Right.
revolution post-USSR. So
Right.
people don't even get that, and of course then you can't have a conversation about anything.
Right. This stuff is very complicated, and I know that like sometimes you'll be speaking, and someone will ask you a question, and you'll be very polite to them, but you'll go, I don't know that I can, explain this to you in 2 minutes in a Barnes and Noble. Like this is a little involved. But what are the when you read this interview, or you're reading it, and he's asked, can you go into this about somebody's asked him, how does that come up? Do they just say like innocuously, "Hey, do you remember where you were when JFK was shot"?
He was interviewed, and I don't have a transcript of this. As I recall, and I wrote Family of Secrets some years ago, and I'm a little bit hazy on a few things, but as I recall, he was interviewed by a Japanese television network news crew, and it was I believe he was vice president at the time, and it was kind of a softball interview, and they didn't really know what to ask him, so they said, "Oh, you've had such an interesting life. Tell us about some of the great historical moments and your thoughts on them." And so one question was, when John F. Kennedy was shot, where were you when you heard, and what was your reaction? Well, first, where were you when you heard? And he just basically sort of went white. He just blanched, and he wasn't expecting the question, and he couldn't answer it. And people say to me, well, why did he not answer? I say, more interestingly, where was he?
Right.
And so I went more to the where was he?
Right.
If he couldn't remember, I'd just like to know where he was.
Right.
Since he doesn't remember. And I spent years, believe it or not, trying to find out. And
do you remember the moment when you're reading that interview that you just go, this is... Like, or when you come aware, do you automatically, when something like that happens with a guy like him, do you automatically go, wait a minute, there's a problem?
Yeah, there were some of these things were in other books. This was in a book where it was raised. It just said he couldn't remember when it was, and then it went on. So what I did was I read a lot of these books. I did as many interviews as I could, and I would see things. I go, wait a minute, wait a minute here. What do you mean he doesn't remember where he was? I'm going to do that. And so there went years. There I went into years of research, and that took me down what I would call a rabbit's hole, where I began to be on a whole subterranean level of American history, American politics, American power, and I was like, holy cow, I am in some place I didn't know existed. And really, it's largely thanks to that and a series of other bizarro reckonings.
Revelations. Yeah.
Now, all right, so first of all, you found one of the first things you found was a memo from the day of the assassination, right? From the CIA, where the FBI was briefing Bush.
Yes, these memos were out there, but were not well known and not thoroughly studied, except by the person who found it, who went as far as they could go. Yeah, there were a couple of interesting memos. One was they were both FBI memos, and they had been released under the JFK Records Act in the early 90s as a result of public outcry after Oliver Stone's JFK film, and everybody became upset. Stone pushed for the release of documents. He's a great American hero, Oliver Stone, in my opinion. Yeah. He forced all this stuff to be released, along with a lot of activists. In any case, the records released these things, and one of them was this declassified FBI memo, or two of them, and one of them was from J. Edgar Hoover, and it basically, to J. Edgar Hoover, but basically the memo said that there was a briefing conducted the day after the shooting about the assassination, and that there were two people from other intelligence agencies who were briefed. The FBI explaining this, they said, we briefed Mr. So-and-so of military intelligence, and we briefed Mr. George Bush of the Central Intelligence Agency. And I looked at that and I said, wow, that's
what are
really
the chances?
Interesting. Yeah, unless this is another guy. And there's a whole backstory where eventually, when that came out, Vice President Bush's office claimed, it must have been another George Bush, and could tell that whole story. But so that was one memo. The second memo was also an FBI memo, and this was from the day of the assassination. Within about an hour of Kennedy being shot, a man called one of the FBI offices in Texas, identified himself fully, this time as George H.W. Bush, with his home address. He said he was in the oil business, so we know this was him. And he said, I've heard the president's been shot. I may have some information on a possible suspect. Now, that alone, for a man who can't remember where he was when he was shot, the fact that he called from Texas.
That you got to think
Columbo.
about. You got to think about. I didn't even put that together. Is that he's trying to solve the crime? This is, I mean, this is amazing. So these memos are out there. Why are they not? I mean, I'm sure there's obvious answers for this. Why are they not better known?
The media is terrified of almost everything. The media is like Don Knotts. Remember Don Knotts, Knotts?
Okay, yeah.
The quivering, skinny actor who was always afraid of his shadow. That's the media. The media likes to act very, very tough and macho, but the truth is the media is always scared of its shadow. And the shadow is, breaking away from the pack, having a different story, because the risk is everybody turns on you.
Right.
The whole media pack seeks to tear you apart like wild dogs. And so everybody knows that, and they won't go out on their own. And so everybody's waiting. They all, by the way, would really love to do these stories.
Right.
But they're waiting.
These seem like the fun stories.
Yeah, of course they are. So
Right.
they're all waiting for the go-ahead. There's a turning point in certain stories. You take, I don't care what it is, the Lewinsky story, stories about almost anything that became a huge story. They all knew this stuff early, and they would talk about it over a beer, but they would never report it because they didn't want to get in trouble. But when it started somehow attaining critical mass, that was the moment. And then the bosses say, go. And they say, go and get a little bit ahead of the pack. Stay in the same direction, but get a little bit ahead.
Now, do you think that we've seen in this country, especially over the past 30, 40 years, a consolidation of the media by, corporate conglomerates, and a lot of people just subscribe that, to profit-seeking models and whatnot. Do you think there was a deliberate attempt by the people, whoever this nexus of people in power is, to deliberately shape the media? Of course, they have a motive to, but do you think there's a more long-term look to that, or do you think it's kind of a random effect of profit seeking?
There is not an institution of any kind anywhere in the world that does not seek order through control. I don't care if it's a family or a little restaurant or whatever. If there's a lot of dissent, if people are grumbling, if they're gossiping, if they're encouraging their fellow members of this organization to ask questions,
Start throwing people off the boat.
This causes problems, and the institution can't have it. And this is why most of us work for big corporations. The big corporations are always doing that happy talk. They could go on the 10K run for that cause, and everybody gets free T-shirts and so on. This is all carefully calculated, not because they care about these causes. I'm not saying some of them probably do, but principally because they're practicing good management, which is keep the people happy on the plantation, basically.
Now, now George H.W. Bush calls and informs on this guy. I think it was James Parrott. And he says this guy was spouting off some very hateful rhetoric or something like that. What is the purpose of doing that?
So he called about this man, and the whole call was strange because he didn't call the Dallas FBI office, and Kennedy was shot in Dallas, and Bush was near Dallas at the time he called. He called the Houston FBI office, which didn't make any sense, except that Parrott was in Houston. Well, if Parrott was in Houston and Kennedy was shot in Dallas, who cares about Parrott?
Right.
But he calls and what I discovered through my research was the man who took the call and filed the report was actually a friend of his. It doesn't say that in the report. So he calls a friend of his inside the Houston FBI thing. The friend dutifully makes a record that Mr. George H.W. Bush has called from Tyler, Texas. Now you might say, well, what's Tyler, Texas? I don't know what it is. I'll tell you what it isn't. It isn't Dallas.
Right.
It's a place. Actually, I will tell you what it is. It's a place very near Dallas that's not Dallas. And so when you say I'm in Tyler, Texas, when it gets back to Washington, it's just some guy somewhere else in Texas is calling to help, and he's reporting on this man. And the whole thing was ludicrous. It was pretty clear that this James Parrott hadn't done anything. And my research, I found that, in fact, weirdly enough, George H.W. Bush, who claimed he barely knew who this man was, James Parrott was like an aide to him, and he was sort of ratting out a guy he knew couldn't possibly have had anything to do with this.
Right.
And the best thing of all, is
this is insane.
The best thing of all is here's a man who's supposedly a suspect in the murder of the President of the United States. And so what happens is, instead of the FBI doing anything, they ask, this is true story, they have some guy go and bring Mr. Parrott into, and I think it was the Secret Service office in Houston, and he brings him in just so they could chat with him. So I'm thinking, how many TV shows have we seen where they're kicking the door down for the slightest infraction?
Right.
And here they are. Yeah, well, if he's a suspect in the murder of the president, when it's convenient for him, drive him on down and you'll have a chat with him. So The man who drives him down, it turns out, is an even higher ranking aide to Poppy Bush. And he knows this guy, and he drives him down, and he actually says, oh, yeah, I was at Mr. Parrott's house at the time of the shooting, so I could tell you that he didn't have anything to do with it. So you have this ludicrous scene.
So the guy driving him down is his witness.
Yeah. And the guy driving him down is also George H.W. Bush's chief aide within the Houston Republican Party that Mr. Bush is the chairman of at the time.
How did you discover all these, like, when you say he's his top aide, what are you looking at? What are you researching?
I mean, the internet definitely helps. I still use a lot of paper. I travel a lot. I go to archives. I collect stuff.
You talk to people. You knock on doors.
I interview a lot of people.
Yeah.
I go to these, ancient, microfiche, microfilm, and I destroy my eyesight trying to read weird old classified ads from 1952.
And this took you 5 years.
It did, yeah.
Yeah. So all of these revelations. Are you now in your new book, which I want to talk a little bit about? I know that you're working on something, and it deals with some of the same material with the Kennedy assassination. Why is that moment so important for you? You have great revelations and family secrets about Watergate, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. So why is the Kennedy assassination such a huge thing for you?
Well, it's a huge thing for me because it wasn't a huge thing for me.
Right.
Most people know that he was killed. Most people know that there's some controversy. Most people know that people will get in each other's faces at a party over this sort of thing. They know there are a lot of books. Most of us haven't really read this stuff. We haven't really studied it. It's a subset of the population that has. And so the rest of us don't really know too much. Most journalists, by the way, this is a dirty little secret, are not all that well read. They don't read books necessarily. They don't know that much about history or the broader picture. And most journalists don't know anything about this. So, but they've heard that Oswald did it. That's what the government concluded, and that's what all supposedly sane people concluded, and that anybody who gets into saying something else is supposed to be a nut.
Right.
And so the same thing as they're worried about getting out ahead of or away from the pack, they're not going to do it here either. They stay with the conventional narrative. So I did too. I mean, as a journalist, I didn't know anything about it. If somebody started talking to me about Lee Harvey Oswald, I would tune them out. But because of my work on the Bushes, and because I discovered, and this is really, I think, the key point here in Family of Secrets, perhaps, is that it is the undiscovered twists and turns of history that give us an entirely new understanding of who we are,
right,
and how we got where we are and where we're going and what this is really all about. It's almost like it has the profundity of theology in a sense, because it really just changes everything,
right.
And so
and not necessarily for the better.
Well, I mean, I would argue that in the end, we all need to know the truth.
Right.
Because if you don't, things just get
you alone
worse.
would argue that. But yeah.
Now, when you look at, you mentioned like being labeled a nut, and you look at there's a lot of, especially in the past 10 years, a lot of conspiracy stuff on YouTube. There's guys like Alex Jones, and it seems like, besides you and a few other examples, for the most part, these people, like Alex Jones, for instance, will have a lot of information that comes out that turns out to be truthful. Sometimes he can sound very cogent, and then other times he just sounds like a lunatic.
And then he will be challenging Hillary Clinton to take her globalist army against his Christian army. Like there's
we have a guy like David Icke who will talk a lot about these a lot of overlapping things to what will happen in the family secrets of these families over time,
hidden power structure.
But then they're all lizard people. So
So what happens to these people where it starts to become cartoonish?
The real danger here, and I don't know what motivates them. The real danger here is that when the most important material is co-opted and dominated by people who are a mix of right and horribly wrong, and frankly quite reckless.
Right.
They're not careful researchers. What happens is they own that turf. And I have to say, if I were the bad guys, if I were the ones who wanted the public to keep the public in the dark, I would want people like that out there basically tarring legitimate inquiries by putting a crazy spin on it.
Do you think there's any things, the notion that perhaps they are poison in the well, and that guys like that are somehow put up to it, or
all I can tell you is they're the only thing you conclude is either they are doing it deliberately, putting out bad stuff and mixing it with good stuff, or they're not doing it deliberately, and I don't know what's worse.
Right.
They're both very problematical.
Right. Now, when you start going to your friends with the revelations of things we're talking about, you're going to people, you're going, take a look at this. What is the reception that you get from other journalists?
This has been very hard for me.
Yeah.
I had, I think, a good reputation. I was careful. I wrote for and produced and so forth some of the best news organizations in the world, and never had any problems of any kind in my career. And once I started doing this, I was warned. People said, that is the electrified third rail. You're going where people never from which people never return. And people just kind of warned me. I mean, everybody warned me from one end to the other, including people in the publishing world, that you can't get this published. It's going to destroy you. Or do the book, but leave out the Kennedy and the Watergate stuff, which turned out to be
that's the book.
No, I won't say
Right.
who it is, but some people who were close to the publishing process, encouraged me not to put that stuff in.
Oh my God.
People, all kinds of people gave me advice. They said, please, I beg you for your own career, don't do this, because they understood. And indeed, when Family of Secrets came out, we were expecting a tremendous reception. It's a book published by a very well-respected publishing house. The book has more than 1,000 footnotes. It's carefully written.
Even your detractors have said how well-researched the book is, which is, they have to put that in, And none of the people, and I've read some of the negative reviews, they don't really challenge you on substance. They call you names. They say, well, this is paranoid. This is, you're connecting things, but they don't talk about those memos. They don't go there, so it is interesting.
it almost begs the question: what would there need to be? What kind of smoking gun?
Right. What
Do they
would
need to have
get
a
people?
confession?
Well, they have a real. The people who are critics of this kind of what you might call breakthrough journalism are real hypocrites, because at the slightest evidence of something that they want to put out, they say it's enough. And then on the other hand, there's no matter how many things you have. And by the way, one of the reasons I'm doing the Kennedy book is because I now believe that John F. Kennedy was removed from office by the same people who make a business of removing world leaders from office when they displease power structures. And I think those elements still are very much present in American society and in other countries. And I think Bernie Sanders called it the 1%, but whatever it is, they definitely...
Who would you describe these people if you had to... And I know that there's, we talk about the ruling elite, and I think one of the things that's interesting about Family of Secrets is you talked a little bit about this nexus of the extraction of natural resources, banking, and sort of the defense industry, and how they all meet at some point. So these people, this industry of removing leaders, and what can you just tell us a little bit about them?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people want to believe that it is, shape-shifting lizards who run society, or people, members of a small secret society who meet and have various incantations or what have you. It's not that neat. What it is it's society at the highest levels perpetuating itself. It's the same people who will sue each other in a second and send private investigators after each other, also able to break bread and come together when they share a common enemy. And so it's the system. It is the military. It is the intelligence apparatus. It is a lot of these different elements, banking and so on, but you can't point to somebody. A lot of people like to say it's some person,
the Rothschilds,
It doesn't work like that. It's a constant attempt to create a consensus among the wealthiest, most powerful people. All of these things that people think are so sinister, like the Bilderberg gathering, the World Economic Forum, and so on, they're not as sinister as people say. They're really just people hanging out who have
Right.
common interests and
Right.
talking about them,
Right.
which is what everybody does. You know, working class people do it in a bar near a construction site. They just don't have any power, so it doesn't matter what they talk about. Ain't nothing going to happen. But
Yeah.
these people, when they talk and they say, you know, this guy Kennedy, you know, he really seems like a loose cannon. I think he's dangerous. And somebody else says, I agree with you,
Yeah.
and then things begin
But
to
murder-
happen.
You think?
Yeah,
Sorry.
Murder does seem to be the one step where you could when you say the Bilderberg, people that are essentially, it's, you know, the highest level of networking. But the idea that you would remove a democratically elected leader, which I know shouldn't shock me because this group of people has done it all over the world. But the idea that they would do something like that, or the idea that they would, you know, harass, intimidate, or murder journalists, that is where people, I think, would be on some level, even the cynical people, shocked.
Yeah, the way I would explain it is this: most of the people, even in the elite circles, have clean hands,
Right.
in the sense they don't know and they don't want to know,
Right.
and they don't need to know.
Right.
We have apparatuses like the military special forces where people are trained, you know, to kill somebody with their bare hands and stuff. What do they do when they leave the military or they need
Right.
to take in some extra
Right.
income? I mean,
Right.
what are you going to do?
They don't
You're
become
not-
comedians.
And
Right.
they don't deliver newspapers, so
Right.
they have tools of their trade.
Right.
Those are people, and I've interviewed these people, and they tell me my job is to follow orders, and I never ask questions. When you're in
Right.
the military, you're trained never ask questions, and so it's not that hard to understand that if somebody's told to go to a particular location and fire at a car, that is what they will do.
Right.
Now, do you? Sorry, but with the idea of. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. But
It's easy to do with this
Yeah.
material.
Yeah, it's very heavy. That's what I love. What I love about your stuff is that there's meat on the bone. I mean, this is literally, and I mean, when you hear conversations about whether what Donald Trump said was or wasn't racist, it's amazing that people. Do you ever get frustrated when you hear people what like average people discuss when because you're out, you're at a barbecue wherever you are, and you hear people talking? Do you ever just check out and go, I just can't even participate?
This is a continuation of
Yeah.
this sort of distraction of the public from what actually matters or what actually affects them. And I see this, and people say to me, I hope you're for Hillary because this Donald Trump is dangerous. And, you know, they're just shaking and
Right.
they're red in their face.
Right.
And they don't really understand the extent to which this is sort of an entertainment, a spectacle,
Right.
you know, bred
Yeah.
in circuses.
Yeah.
And that, you know, yes, these things matter in certain ways on certain levels, but the fact of the matter is it doesn't matter whether it's Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. They would never be allowed to deviate substantively from the course of American policy over the course of decades on the biggest issues affecting the wealthiest people. You're talking about resource extraction. You're talking about the constant use of the military to control much of the world. You're talking about the dominance of the financial sector. These things are inviolable.
Right.
Where they differ are, at least in the way they talk about hot button issues that get people riled up.
Right.
But there's even limits on what they can do in those areas. And so, yes, it's important. Should it suck all the air out of the room and make us so exhausted that come November we stop paying attention right when the real work begins? No.
You do heavy stuff. You write about very powerful people. Are you, you know, we've seen, I don't know much about it, but a death of a journalist, Michael Hastings, it would seem questionable, you know? Are you ever worried? Do you ever say to yourself, I'm really putting stuff out there? Is that something that crosses your mind at all?
It does. I think you have to be realistic. I think any human being should be careful in any case. I try to take reasonable precautions, but at the same time, you have to live your life.
Right.
And one of the reasons I started WhoWhatWhy.org, our news website, is because I thought, well, let's build something big and deep, and let's train a whole new generation of investigative reporters. Let's make it all funded by readers and not take any ads and have no corporations in there, and build something that's sort of protected so that nobody can easily cut the head off of it.
Right. The interesting thing about seeing a guy like Michael Hastings, who we can't say for sure, but most likely was murdered, most of the situations I seem to read, there's a lot of information just out there for anyone to find, and the powers that be seem to be content to be the people too apathetic to care. And they're just like, we're just going to...
Yeah, what makes someone a threat?
Right. Yeah, well, by the way, I'm proud of the fact that WhoWhatWhy was, I believe, the first news organization on that story.
Yes.
We've done that again and again. We raised questions about the FBI's foreknowledge and relationships with the Boston Marathon bombers.
Yeah.
We've taken a look at, they had a prior relationship with the Orlando shooter. These things, people start hearing it, and now the scales come down over their eyes because it's uncomfortable. But these are things that need to be looked into and understood. The Hastings thing, again, there was an FBI angle, there was a CIA angle. He had angered the military.
It could have been any. It's like Kennedy.
Yeah.
Could have been anybody.
Yeah.
Right. Well, let me ask you a question now, because the Boston Marathon bombing seems to be one of the most emotional things that I've tried to broach this, because I have been on WhoWhatWhy, and I have read a lot of what you've written. I have watched some of the talks. I've listened to some of the podcasts. It seems to be something where when I bring it up, people get very upset with me. I can only imagine how upset people get with you. Just for a minute or two, talk about a few of the things as a journalist that bothered you about that event and the way it was covered.
Well, the first thing was how quickly the authorities concluded that they had solved it. Whenever they announce they have solved something so fast, especially where it's a violent thing and it's kind of complicated, I want to know more about it. And again, this is my business. I saw certain things falling into place that looked to me too neat, and they didn't look properly verified. And I said, the fix is in. That's the same exact thing that was it 50 years before they did with Lee Harvey Oswald. And in fact, there are eerie echoes, because the Tsarnaev in Boston had been to Russia. Lee Harvey Oswald had been to Russia. The Tsarnaev had family members who were connected to the CIA. Lee Harvey Oswald had family members who were connected with intelligence.
Have you tried to speak to their family, the mother, or anything, or is that completely...
Yeah,
that's the type of stuff where you start to get in trouble.
I can't talk too much about that because
Gotcha.
there is I'll just tell you this,
Yeah.
there is a real clampdown on that subject.
Okay.
Whatever really happened there is so problematical for this state that they have put tremendous resources in making sure that nobody will ever figure it out.
Wow.
Because, listen, it's very, very simple. When you have a government, the only way that you keep calm and you keep people focused on their productive work and so forth is that they need to feel that things are under control.
Right.
If it turns out that the government screws up horribly, maybe by accident, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt, gave some guy a bomb-making kit because they wanted to catch some other guys, but then oops, the bomb went off. They have to cover this stuff up.
Right. Because that would look horrible.
Well, they'd all lose their jobs, and that's the bottom line. Is that in any institution, it's about self-protection.
And this trial of now I know I was at a party with the actor who's playing Tsarnaev in the new movie. Okay, by accident. I was not there. I was just there at this party.
Following the kid?
No, I was there, and I spoke to him, and I kind of brought up some of your stuff, and he was kind of like, well, I met everybody, and the police chief gave us a tour, and this Danny, this carjacking victim, I don't know if the kid's being on the level, supposedly they met and spoke to this guy. Danny, this mysterious carjacking victim who's
never had a last name.
We don't know who he is. Kato Kalin, we know from O.J. Simpson, was on TV every night when I grew up. And you would think that, is anyone shy? Does anyone not want fame? Does anyone not want to be...
For listeners, this guy, this guy's story changed radically over the course of a few interviews.
Right. Right. And again, I'm proud of the fact that we went into great detail about that.
Yeah.
The media has not done nothing on any of this.
Right.
Even when I went to them and I said, well, you reported, he told you one thing, and now, how he escaped from the carjackers, and in the later versions, it's a completely different story. Obviously, he's lying, and he's a main witness in this whole thing.
Right.
And they said, I can't talk to you. The guy's no longer at our station. immigration. He's, won't return calls.
And
people are scared, and this Danny guy, all these characters are rolled out. This professor from Northeastern University who pops up all the time is like the expert, always standing next to whoever's being interviewed on TV. This is a stage managed production,
right?
And this is what they call psyops at its finest. People don't even know anything about psyops. Most journalists don't even know about it. That the military, the CIA, everything have whole departments where all they do. This story now about Syria with this little girl who was murdered, was killed by a bomb. Do you know how many children have been killed by bombs? And by the way, many of them are our bombs.
Right.
But when you take one child and you put the spotlight on it, you use Twitter and Facebook and everything, you get everybody angry at one person who's responsible for that particular atrocity, and all the others don't exist at all. There's no context. It's all about controlling the emotions.
Now, there's very interesting about this Omar Mateen and about guy James Holmes. This is very interesting. A lot of these guys that flip out, that shoot up movie theaters and nightclubs, at one time had tried to get into the United States military. That's something that you've raised on Who, What, Why.
They've tried to get in the military. They've tried to get into police departments.
Right.
They were almost all of them were very gung-ho about the society and the system.
So if we're very cynical people, are we thinking there's some angle where they don't get into the official military, but they get into some black ops program, some mind control thing that doesn't go well or goes wrong, or are they guinea pigs? Are they what I mean,
the problem with any of these topics is they begin to sound crazy.
No, but
unless you know, and you go and you happen to Google something called MK Ultra,
right,
and you find out that there was a program, maybe still is a program, which is, all governments do this. They test people's minds to see what they are capable of doing. The CIA did this for decades. It was discovered by the Senator Frank Church's committee in the 70s, and the CIA people were forced to testify. They admitted they were trying to see if you could create a Manchurian candidate. Could you get somebody against their will to go and kill somebody? And so when we look at all of these things, like Hinckley shooting Ronald Reagan, and then it turns out Hinckley's were friends of the Bush family. It's too weird, and so
insane.
People don't want to hear, and they go, "This is it's just got to be just a weird coincidence." When you look at Sirhan and how the L.A. coroner actually said that Robert Kennedy was killed with a shot from behind his head, and you can see in the pictures that Sirhan is in front of him. None of these things get investigated. Let me put it this way: what we do, it's like shooting fish in a barrel, because nobody else, even the so-called edgy, kind of progressive, youth-oriented news organizations, won't touch any of this stuff. It's all off the table.
Does WikiLeaks change the dynamic at all in a meaningful way?
Probably not. It certainly had an impact and will have an impact, but I think that it was one where the New York Times and all of them were eager to get a piece of that, because they first they struggled. They didn't want to do it. They were afraid, and then everybody else, the Guardian's doing it. See, that's what I'm talking about, the path. Then they're all in,
point.
and then they're all safe. So now they're doing it. So that was for a while, but then they turned on him and on them later on. And, of course, he himself has some issues with his personality and the things he says, and so he doesn't help himself. But that was a revolutionary moment, less them, to be honest, than
Snowden, or
what's his name? The one who took the documents.
Bradley Manning, Chelsea Manning.
Chelsea Manning. Going with the name change here.
Right.
Chelsea Manning. That's the person who really took the biggest risk, and you see that her life is destroyed. They're really
tragic.
They're
45 years
humiliating her, keeping her in horrible conditions.
This is horrible.
Worse than they do with a mass murder.
What about that guy Barrett Brown too?
Barrett Brown. All of this is designed to send a message, and it does. It says, don't do this stuff.
Don't do it.
Right.
Don't leak.
Now, one big objection that a lot of supposedly rational people will say when you bring up stuff like, Kennedy assassination, 9/11, I don't believe that anyone in the government's competent enough to keep this secret for so long. But then you see, with any of the numerous CIA coups in the 50s and the 60s, with Iran, Guatemala, the Gulf of Tonkin staging, that these things were kept under wraps for 30, 40, 50 years plus. Do you think the CIA and the intelligence apparatus tries to portray themselves in a somewhat incompetent fashion.
Yes, and in fact, there are books that have won the Pulitzer Prize and so on about the CIA, and while they're good books, they
Legacy of Ashes, things like
they
that.
also portray the CIA as somewhat incompetent, and they always try to say that I just heard the New York Times had a New York Times magazine had a very long piece where a guy went all over the Arab world interviewing people, and I heard him interviewed on the radio, and he said, what was his conclusion? His conclusion was the U.S. goes in trying to do good stuff and screws it up. And I think, oh my God, see, that's the disinformation, that they're necessarily trying to do good stuff. And so the whole thing is, as you put it, I think very aptly, that these things are kept secret because the consequences of speaking about them, I mean, we were just talking about Chelsea Manning and so on, the consequences of sticking your neck out are great, and people don't do it. Very few people in any situation, in a company or anywhere else, people see wrongdoing going on all the time. Very few people within a police department, wherever it is, will prisoners, they're told, don't be a rat,
Right.
And so they're not going to do it. They're not going to do it, and these things are preserved. Now, if you really look hard, you will always find a few people who know something and are saying something, but they're always dismissed as kooks or being disgruntled or seeking fortune or something like that.
Now, even great writers, you've people like Jane Mayer, Seymour Hersh. These are really good investigative reporters. They write, serious books about serious issues, but even they shy away. Do you think it's fear of their professional reputation being injured?
Absolutely. I mean, another example of a very fine writer is Robert Caro with his whole series on LBJ, but he comes right up. He basically says that LBJ was a kind of a murderous psychopath, incredibly corrupt individual, and he comes right up, and then he kind of stops with the Kennedy assassination because he couldn't do it. He could not do that.
What is it about you that just pushes forward? I mean, that's because there's got to be something about guys like you and thank God we have them, that just ignore the warnings, go and just do it.
It just seems to me a life well lived to go for it and do the right thing.
This is the real story, I think.
I wouldn't want to be a journalist if I wasn't just going for the truth.
Yeah. And the new book, and I know that you've still got some time to really, do some research. Is it a book where you think it's going to have some really startling material, or is it it will?
Yeah, I mean, I'm startled every single day by things I'm putting together. I think that the Kennedy assassination story is really the key to unlocking what happened to America, and really explains what I think now was sort of the death of real democracy half a century ago, and that we've never recovered from that.
Right.
Now, is it because there seems to be like for Stone, for instance, Oliver Stone, I feel like, a lot of what his directions are good, but then he goes to this point where like Kennedy was this almost savior figure. It's not so much that he was so good, more as like these other forces he was disrupting. He wasn't, right? Like, is that what you're getting at? Well, I mean, I also will have a lot about him and what he was doing, and much to my astonishment, but it's entirely consistent with everything else. Somebody with Family of Secrets said, you really ought to call it Everything You Thought You Knew Is Wrong. Well, it turns out it's logical. It's totally consistent. The same people who are able to shape public perceptions try to do it on everything. So almost everything is wrong to some extent. And the Kennedy thing is wrong, too. They try to paint him as being pro-war, not really wanting to do much about civil rights and so on, and it turns out not to be true. He actually was quite an admirable and even a very courageous figure who had all these ideas of things he wanted to do, and he was doing as many of them as he could while also trying to make the right decisions about how to get reelected and not alienate the ruling class too much. It was a very, very difficult act.
Do you think George H.W. Bush shares some culpability for the assassination?
Well, if you read Family of Secrets, you'll know that I figured out where he was that day.
Right.
So I think the answer would be, in some way, yes.
Right.
Now, the interesting thing about a guy like George H.W. Bush, he spends most of his, like, the substantive part of his life. I mean, he's a politician, but he's doing all this stuff behind the scenes for some ulterior motive. Then he becomes the president. Do you look at his presidency? Does it seem to be any boon to these goals that they have? Is it particularly effective for their ends?
He doesn't seem to have been that effective as a policymaker, because that's that vision thing he wasn't so good at.
Right.
He was very interested in the behind the. He was like one of the key architects of this whole sort of Iran-Contra thing. I don't know that he was smart enough. Somebody else created it.
Right.
But he bought into these things, and then he kind of knew. He's a networking guy. He knows who and who you could bring on board that will work with so and so.
Now, comparatively speaking, where do you put Bill and Hillary Clinton? Because they seem to be shrewd political operators.
I think they made their peace with the ruling cliques.
Right.
And I think they understood. If you look at Bill Clinton's presidency, he made no efforts to take on the national security state at all. Jimmy Carter did, and Jimmy Carter was kept to a single term.
Right.
Bill Clinton did not. Bill Clinton also was really quite friendly with Wall Street. He passed many of the things that the wealthy wanted, all these so-called reforms like welfare reform, banking reform, and so on. So he really was quite, in many ways, a loyal cooperator with the system. And then on other things, he was a little bit more adventurous and maybe a little bit more, let's say, conscientious.
Yeah, I think people are very reticent to believe a lot of this, because at the end of the day, everybody's got to believe something that kind of gets them up in the morning. And, as cynical, like somebody told me the other day, I said, what do you think the biggest problem with the country is? And this is a guy that I love and respect, and he was like, special interest. But it's like, that's like the beginning of, it's such a saccharine way to phrase what's really going on when you look at some of these issues where you have really questionable, problematic events like the Boston Marathon bombing that aren't fully investigated, that we don't know much about. 9/11, while it probably, from the information out there, wasn't, what these people are saying, a lot of the 9/11 truth movement says it is, but the official narrative, as well as you've documented on Who, What, Why, doesn't hold up either. So the truth lives somewhere in between the lizard people and the official narrative, and but it's still quite unsettling for most people. Do you have a way to kind of pull people out of their comfort zone in a way that you find to be effective, because a lot of this stuff is very troubling?
Yes, I've spent years studying how you do this. How do you deal with people's cognitive dissonance? I do a lot of public speaking. There's invariably one or two people in the room who I can see becoming traumatized,
right.
And they're losing control of themselves. They're becoming very, very angry at me, and they do want to kill the messenger, because you see, we live very good lives here in America. Most of us, we are very comfortable. We always have enough to eat. Even if you're struggling in certain ways, it's really not that hard compared to the vast majority of the people in the world. And we really have sort of artificially subsidized good lives, and we don't want to hear too much about how the sausage is made.
Right.
And so we block it out. The liberals, the sort of ones here who they love Hillary Clinton and so on, they're part of the problem too, because they think they're virtuous and they tell their kids they're virtuous, and they shop at Whole Foods and they compost and whatever they do, but they have no acknowledgement. I mean, most of the lawyers for the corporate world are liberals, and they all vote for Hillary or whatever, and there's no sense of their own culpability in propping up this very, very corrupt system. And so nobody wants to hear about it. But I have to say that there is a growing demand for this kind of truthiness, or whatever you call it, truthfulness.
Yeah.
People really do want it, and they feel liberated by it. The example I give is, I say that people say, I don't want to hear, and then I say, well, let me ask you this: if you're in your house and and suddenly you smell smoke, or there's like flames licking under the door, do you say, nah, I'm not really in the mood to deal with that? You don't do that. And I say, we're talking about the flames and the smoke that's licking at our doors all the time, so we better pay attention to it. And there are more and more people who get it, and they get that. Even as sort of daunting as this all is in some ways, it's also weirdly sort of electrifying,
right?
Because you suddenly discover this, the sort of the holy grail. You suddenly everything makes sense. And one of the reasons a lot of us are depressed, or our society is depressed, is because nothing makes any sense, and we therefore don't know what to do with it. When it all starts making sense, suddenly you know what to do about it. You know who's responsible, and you know what can be done to fix it.
Are some of the people at the top terrified of any type of accountability?
Sure, and they are hoping and doing what they can to promote competing journalistic brands, other people's books. Don't read Family of Secrets, read such and such instead. Don't have Russ Baker on Meet the Press, have so-and-so instead. He's maybe a little better. This is how they do it. It's all very, very subtle.
And going forward, if you do start to gain more traction, more success, do you think that there'll be an attempt to co-opt you? By a larger...
I think that's when things get dangerous, because they will come at you with everything.
Right.
Well, that's the thing. Do you? And I know you don't do gut feelings because you're a good reporter and stuff like that, so you could just wink. But when you read a Hastings thing, do you have a gut feeling that he really stepped on the wrong toes, or do you think that just out of nowhere, Mercedes, which seems to be a relatively responsible mode of transportation, malfunctioned in an odd way?
I look at that stuff in a forensic way. That's how we do all of our work. I know that he had enemies, but see, some people who have enemies are also, he also had a volatile personality. Could he have been drinking or distracted, and his car jumped off the street and rode up and hit a tree? Yes. Yeah. My question would be, does a car that hits a tree explode in that manner? Is an engine of a Mercedes ejected violently in that fashion? The people I've spoken to tell me no. And so I'm interested in that. The fact that his neighbor said that he told her that he thought that somebody had been tampering with his car, these are not nothing. And so I feel like we are the responsible ones, and the others are the irresponsible ones, because we're asking reasonable questions, and we're asking them of people who have expertise. Our handicap with Who, What, Why, and with the work that I do
is funding.
Because this is a lot of work. And really, to do it, I need teams of people. I need to be able to get off other things that I'm doing in order to focus on the difficult aspects of this. And what we find is that even people who love what we do, they don't necessarily step up. We haven't trained ourselves that if we want the right thing, we have to get behind it in every possible way.
And can people go and donate on your website?
They can, yeah.
Yeah, and whowhatwhy.org. Again, visit, donate, $5, whatever you can do.
Whatever you can do. We got a Twitter at WhoWhatWhy, Facebook, all of these things. They all make a difference. Pick up a copy of Family of Secrets and tell your friends. Give copies to your friends.
I'm telling you right now, pick up a copy, and I know we're going to get out of here in a few minutes, but the Barbara Bush memo in that book, to me, is my favorite part of the book. That's when I got chills. The memo that was reproduced, that she wrote, it started when Kennedy was shot, ended when he was dead. She's writing it from a hair salon in Texas. To me, Russ, is one of the most fascinating things in the book. Could you just tell us a little bit about that before we get you out of here? Because
look, there's so many, even though it is substantive and sometimes disturbing material, I also try to write it in a really entertaining way.
It's funny. I mean,
and it's got weird things like that section. I put these subheads. I call call it Barbara's Big Hair Day.
Yes.
Or bad hair day.
Bad hair day.
Bad hair day.
And
yeah.
it's this crazy memo that I think is she's writing to her children who aren't old enough. They're 10.
In a nutshell.
Yeah, in a nutshell.
This is a letter they produce decades later when they have to explain where Poppy was the day Kennedy was shot, and it's a letter that's providing him, like the Parrot phone call, more cover that he was somewhere other than Dallas. And yet, when I studied that letter, and I would invite everyone, when you read Family of Secrets, read that chapter carefully, and you decide for yourself, does that read to you like a real letter that Barbara Bush really wrote under a hairdryer?
And that's why I got
or does
chills.
it read like something that was written later by somebody else?
Right. Before we go, you seem hopeful, you seem optimistic, you seem to be somebody who's in love with their work. I don't know that we have any of these people in our audience, but I was going to say, I mean, we might. If somebody is an investigative journalist out there, if they're at Columbia, if they're at NYU, if they're in trial, what is your advice to people like that want to go out there and even though it's such a daunting task? Well, what do you say to them?
I would say get a day job delivering pizza and then volunteer for WhoWhatWhy. I'm only half joking because our model is largely pro bono, and we have now a very large number of people coming in and volunteering, not as reporters, as editors, as people who are going to do video for us.
Do they need a journalistic background?
Accounting, everything, PR, marketing.
Because you guys utilize a lot of different.
We are a
skills.
Rapidly growing organization.
We should do a fundraiser, a comedy show fundraiser for WhoWhatWhy.
Absolutely.
We should get big comedians to do it because there are big comics. I'm not going to say their names; they have careers, but that are fans, and that might be something to think about. So the website is WhoWhatWhy, Twitter is WhoWhatWhy.
Facebook is WhoWhatWhy. It's kind of easy. You notice a pattern here.
It's pretty easy. That's very good.
Yeah.
The book is Family of Secrets. It's available everywhere. The new book, we got to wait. What do you think?
A year and a half.
Him and his research. I want it tomorrow.
Cut some corners, will you?
Can I get an advanced chapter? We'll see. But listen, I really appreciate you coming by. Some of this stuff is so amazing that it keeps you up at night, but in a good way.
We keep you up at night, but in a good way. I like that. That's my new slogan.
And that's there you go. And that's how we'll end it. Thanks to Russ Baker. Go check him out. Go donate on WhoWhatWhy. We'll be back next week with someone far less interesting.